Welcome to Not Another White Box, the channel that brings you all that's cool, quirky and unusual in the caravan world. My name is Cameron and you're joining me today for volume 2 of my From the Archives tours. Now this is a recent new series that I've started on the channel, and if you checked the last video out, I'll pop a link to it here. You will know that I have a huge collection of caravan literature, brochures, magazines and books and things dating back to the very earliest days of caravanning. And my intention with this series is to showcase some of that to you and also tell quite a lot of stories of how caravans and caravanning in general has changed over the years. So for today's episode, I've partnered again with the Caravan and Motorhome Club to look at 2 of their old magazines, which you can actually check out yourself via their archives, which I'll tell you more about a bit later on in the video. But the theme for today's video is looking back, which seems kind of obvious given that it's a From the Archives tour. But if you allow me to elaborate, basically these 2 magazines that I've chosen to look at today, one is from 1978 and the other one is from 1995. They contain articles that reflect on the history of caravans and how they had changed from the earliest days of caravanning to that present day. But obviously one magazine's from the 70s, one's from the 90s, so the new caravans that they were sort of pitching against these early designs have aged now too. And they're not as far apart in design as you would think. So I've only got 2 magazines to look at today because there is so much to get through. The amount of extra brochures and some incredible historic footage, including a special interview I did with the curator of the Caravan and Motorhome Club archives at the Bewley Motor Museum. So there's so much to get through today. So I'm going to jump straight in to the first magazine, which is this copy of En Route, which is dated March/April 1978. Looking at the front cover of the magazine, straight away it's the traditional Caravan and Motorhome Club green, which has always been their colour, green and red, which is sort of very nostalgic. Obviously the elephant in the room is that the Caravan Club, as it was known, rebranded as the Caravan and Motorhome Club in more recent years. So this magazine comes from an era when the club was known as the Caravan Club, but I'm going to keep referring to it as the Caravan and Motorhome Club, which is as it's known today. So on the cover there we've got a lovely photo of some caravans outside some kind of stately home/house. Just really marketing caravanning as an escape, as freedom. And back in the 1970s, that's what it was. Campsites didn't generally have a lot of facilities and all the things that we demand now. Every campsite usually has a shower block, toilet block, would have Wi-Fi in most cases, and then you move up the ladder and get campsites that have bars and restaurants and swimming pools and gyms and all kinds of things. But back in the 70s, it was literally a field with a water tap. You'd be lucky if it had mains electric, because the caravans weren't fitted with them. So very, very different era for caravanning compared to what we're familiar with now. Opening up the magazine, straight away, we've got an advert, a full-page advert for the Mistral Caravanners hairdryer. I can't talk about this again, but if you check out the last video, I'll pop a link to it above. I did a funny little interview where we found one of these, and it is the hairdryer that is powered by gas. Go check out the video, I'm saying no more. Moving through into the club news section, and this is something that I've picked to talk about today. The news here is that the club, being the Caravan and Motorhome Club, launches caravan courses for caravanners, and these are 10-hour courses called Practical Caravanning, which have been organised by the Caravan and Motorhome Club, which will be held throughout the year, and they were sponsored by Caravans International, B&B Trailers and Lucas. And the idea was that you as the caravanner would take your car with its tow bar fitted, and you would go take part in this 10-hour course, and it would teach you everything from hitching up to towing how to load the caravan, how to use the caravan, but the caravan you would use would be one of their sign-written caravans just for the courses. And hang on, the total cost of this course is £10.80. Not sure what that is in today's money, but you'd have to check. The reason I know about this is because my granddad did one of the very first ones back in 1978, and this is his original workbook from the course, and this is what they provided to the members who attended. My grandparents already had a caravan for a few years by that point. Can't even get into that right now, but if you want to know the history of my grandparents with their caravan, which I still own to this day, check out this video above, and I'll talk you through everything about their 1966 Sprite 400. But for the purposes of today's video, I'm going to stick with this. So the practical caravanning course, it's a very dry book to read, to be honest with you. There are no photos in it, there are no diagrams, it's all just information. But the interesting thing is, my granddad always referred back to this course throughout his 50 plus years of caravanning. He always remembered what he was taught on that day and passed a lot of it down to me. And the club still do these courses. They're predominantly aimed at people who are learning how to tow. But it's been a member service that has been a regular staple of the Caravan and Motorhome Club for nearly 50 years. And people still do them. They're now all over the country, usually March till October. And you can pay a fee, take your car along, and the club still provides the caravan and teaches you how to hitch it up safely, how to pitch it up, and gives you tips for loading it, towing it, just to keep you safe. And it's not even like, people have this conception that it's like doing some kind of voluntary speed awareness course. It's not at all. It's a great educational tool for learning how to use your caravan properly. And like I said, my granddad did that course back in 1978 when they very first launched them. And the information that he learned on that course stuck with him for the rest of his caravanning life. So if you're new to caravanning and you're feeling a bit uneasy and unsure, do check out those courses, because I have it on good authority that they're worth it. So if you're wondering, they started back in 1978. Moving on through the club magazine, like I said, we're going to have to keep things moving today because there's a lot of extra things to show you. There's various bits of news about the clubs. I'm just going to briefly stop on this page that shows some of the club sites that are on the network. And most of these sites have gone now. However, one at the bottom right is Lower Clough Foot near Hebden Bridge, which is still on the club's site network, and I think it's currently called just Hebden Bridge. And I also think Beacon Park in Cornwall, I'm not sure what it's called, but you perhaps jump on me in the comments below. I'm just going to pan the camera over some of these sites, and if you recognise any of the names and perhaps they've changed into something else, do let me know in the comments below. But it's quite nostalgic to see how caravan sites used to look over 50 years ago. The article that I'm really interested in talking to you about today is this one here. Margaret Parrott Remembers. I don't know who this woman is. But she writes in and sends a set of photos of their Eccles caravan from the early 1920s. And I'll just read you a section from the article. It starts, in the 1920s, our car was an open four-seater Vulcan. The 8-foot-long caravan was an Eccles equipped with 2 berths and a cupboard. The door was at the rear. Our lean-to canvases, a forerunner of the awning, were attached by hooks along each side of the caravan. When we went caravanning, we used to ask farmers permission to camp in their fields. This was readily granted, and more often than not, we were given farm bacon and eggs. We cooked for ourselves. We used a Primus stove. Here we are pictured above and below in a field at Sway in Hampshire. I can particularly recollect 2 tours, one in 1926 to Scotland and the other in 1927 to the Wye Valley and Mid Wales. Both were adventures as we went such a long way from home, from our hometown of Bournemouth. In Scotland, we negotiated the rough gravel track of Glencoe, which was then only about 10 feet wide. I had to run behind the outfit with stones to put under the wheels when it looked as if the gradient would beat us. This to me is fantastic. This is the real spirit of freedom that caravanning has sadly lost in the 21st century. Nowadays, everybody wants every conceivable item to make their caravan a true home from home. And it was back in the late 1970s that that trend started to happen. Prior to that, caravans still had a lot in common with this early 1920s Eccles, in that they were still very simple. It was a glorified bed on wheels with very, very basic rudimentary cooking facilities. But the point was you were able to go and explore, and you had the freedom to roam wherever you want with your home on the back. And there's something so wonderfully romantic about that. That notion that you're just travelling on an adventure. And you have to think, in the 1920s, there would have been virtually no other caravans on the road, no campsites or anything. And this lady who wrote this article, Margaret, is remembering stopping in farmers' fields, but by 1978, that was a memory that wasn't too far before that. Like I just said about the campsites, they were starting to become established in the late 1970s. So really they had a good sort of 40, 50 years of caravanning in the wild and at close to nature. But of course, this is from the archives, so I'm delighted to share with you one of the oldest artifacts in my collection, actually, is this original Eccles brochure from 1924. And it's amazing to think that this fragile old document is a century old this year. And I can't wait to show you what's inside it, because it's just so funny to think that in the 1920s, caravanning was a completely new concept. It wasn't widely known. It wasn't something that people just accepted, went on. There were no campsites. There were very few cars on the road, let alone caravans. So the really interesting thing about this brochure is that Eccles aren't really selling their caravans, but rather selling the lifestyle. And straight away on the cover, you've got the Eccles logo, but they call it being free to roam. And it says underneath they are the patented motor caravans. And the quote underneath that is, "Eccles have hundreds on the road." So they want to assure potential customers that this is something that is growing. It's growing in popularity. Also, the fact they're calling them motor caravans is quite poignant, because Eccles only launched their first caravan on the market 5 years before, in 1919. And prior to that, caravans were sort of reserved for the very richest elite, who could have these caravan designs custom built that would be towed, or so should I say, pulled along by horses. And Eccles were the first manufacturer to bring a mass-produced trailer caravan to the market that could be towed by a car. And they still settle on this term motor caravans, which we would associate with motorhomes. But back then, the concept just hadn't completely been worked out by everyone. And like I said, they're not trying to just sell the caravans, they're trying to sell this as a lifestyle. So straight away when we open it up, what we have on the first page on the left is a series of quotes from customers. They tell you what car they tow it with, and just give a bit of information about their experiences so far with an Eccles caravan and caravanning in general. And before they even jump into trying to sell the caravans, we've got this preface, and it sort of explains that this booklet was introduced by the Eccles Motor Caravan Company to assist those who are attracted towards caravanning by natural inclination, yet have not sufficient knowledge of the subject to warrant their attempting a holiday in one. And some of the language in this brochure is fabulous, so I'll keep going. Since we, as pioneers of the motor caravan trade, introduced our vans for pleasure purposes. I'm just reading what it says, don't twist it. Many of our customers have enjoyed some of the happiest days of their lives. It's so innocent and funny. But again, like I said, they're not selling their caravans, they're having to sell this as a lifestyle, which again, the Caravan and Motorhome Club had already been founded in 1907. And as it starts to open up to more and more people, as car ownership filters down into the masses, they have to keep adjusting and reassessing what they're going to include, who they're going to cater for, and that's a constant theme of the Caravan and Motorhome Club over the last century and a bit. As we work through the brochure, they're still going. This article's titled "The Advantage of Possessing a Motor Caravan." They just talk about how you can use your caravan to visit a natural beauty spot, and you can visit another beauty spot that's too remote to be reached by the crowd. And this is kind of funny to me, because in these earliest days of caravanning, when cars were very primitive, caravans were nothing more than a wooden box on wheels, and probably quite heavy as well back then. People were going to some really crazy places with them, such as we saw in the article, scaling Glencoe before it was even had a paved road on it. And they were using cars that had 5, 8, 10, 12 horsepower. Nowadays, we've got the biggest four-wheel drives going to ferry caravans on and off site. And it's just funny how that ethos of how you should caravan, that need to have a vehicle that can take you further and to those remote beauty spots, that ethos has stuck with caravanners for over a century, and we can't seem to shift away from. Caravans should be little homes from home that can take you anywhere, and that filters into the design as well. Just flicking further into the brochure, you can see the pictures of the inside, and there's just lots of wood. There's lots of, very earthly tones, I would imagine, when you read some of the descriptions of the upholstery and things. And they're designed to reflect the natural surroundings where you would find them. And it's at this point I'm going to jump in with something else from my archives, which is a fascinating interview with Sam Alper, who was the founder of Sprite Caravans in the late 1940s, who would later go on to own the Eccles brand and incorporate that into Caravans International. And in the late 70s, going back to when this magazine was current, Eccles Caravans were in a little bit of a crisis, in that they were trying to modernise the brand. They were trying to keep Eccles current and futuristic, but that wasn't met with a good response from the buyers. So they had to resort to market research to find that actually most caravanners who were buying Eccles caravans had their ideals of what a caravan should be based in these 1920s designs and the slightly newer, more streamlined designs of the 1930s. We'll stop waffling and let Sam take it away.
We have two basic restrictions. One is that it's said that people are superstitious about green, and so we tried to avoid anything that looks too green. And because we don't have a particularly warm climate, we should avoid blues. That is really a market requirement, or said to be a market requirement, and I think there's some evidence that that is justified. So that really only leaves the other tones, which also done are warm tones. They're comfortable to live with. In a small space, I had a strong view that if one is using synthetic materials, the design should fit the materials, and to copy wood grain wasn't terribly clever. But in fact, the customers want wood grain. And when you actually look at the designs that have been produced, which are to suit the synthetic materials, when you apply them to furniture, it doesn't look right. So I'm prepared to accept that you can get some quite attractive solutions with wood grain. Whilst logically it would make sense to build the furniture out of aluminium, Fortunately, unfortunately, the customers aren't logical, and quite rightly they say if it looks like a piece of furniture, or it is a piece of furniture, it wants to look like a piece of furniture. And there's no reason why I should try and push what I want onto somebody else.
And presumably no one will ever ask for anything else, because no one will ever design anything else, because no one will ever ask for anything else. I wonder if we've actually found one area of design where the product is set in aspic.
Several years ago, a caravan was done for Caravans International, which used quite a number of modern ideas in terms of having a sunken level floor to get the overall height of the vehicle down. It used coloured surfaces and radii on all the cabinetries. And there was enormous resistance to this in the marketplace, and it didn't sell.
At one point, we went to quite a sophisticated shape. In fact, it wasn't really very successful. Number of reasons, I think. One, it really was a bit expensive. It wasn't sufficiently traditional, and it looked bulky. And I don't think that it's very easy to design that sort of modern shape that doesn't look bulky.
And the model that replaced this so-called modern design was totally reactionary and went back to the upside-down boat roof detail that's been with the caravan trade for 30, 40 years. And this replacement van has been an enormous commercial success.
In fact, it's been quite hard for the manufacturers to keep pace with the demand for their boat-roofed caravans, although ironically they could turn them out faster if they had flat roofs.
So it's fascinating to me that caravanners sort of, by the 1970s, were beginning to dictate the direction that caravan design should go in, because these memories of these earliest days of caravanning had begun to be rose-tinted. They'd forgotten the trouble of getting these caravans into hard-to-reach places because they were heavy and cumbersome and the cars were underpowered. They'd forgotten waking up in the morning to find condensation streaming down the single-pane glass windows. They'd forgotten having to have a toilet outside in a tent. All these things were sort of lost by the sands of time and eroded away to leave you with this rose-tinted view of what a caravan should be, which Caravans International found in the 70s, was trapping design from moving forwards. And it was at this point that Sam Alper lost interest really in the brand, because he couldn't progress further. He was trapped by what the customer wanted to buy, and he had to offer it to them. So when the Eccles was redesigned in the mid-1970s to revert back to a more traditional shape with wood grain and green hues and brown and all those kind of things, it was a massive seller. It was a huge seller into the 1980s. It was one of the best-selling caravan ranges in Britain, and it was all thanks to these earliest days of caravanning. So with that said, we're going to move on in this, sticking with the 1978 magazine, to a road test of the beautiful new Fairholme Curlew. Now, this is also kind of linked to what we've just been talking about, because Fairholme was also under the Caravans International umbrella. And this caravan in 1978 was one of the most premium brands that was available in Britain at the time, but it was mass produced. So there was still a little bit of stigma around these, because it was still built not in the Sprite factory as such, but by the same company that produced Sprite, using many of the same parts, same materials and things, but they had to market it for an older audience who again had those ideals based in the earliest days of caravanning. Of course, you needn't ask, I do have the brochure for Fairholme Caravans in 1978, and you have to remember, these were the cutting edge of design at that particular time in terms of the spec that they offered. And that's the really interesting thing about these caravans, is they're trapped with the earth tones and wood grain, but the customer was also now demanding kit included in them. So for 1978, The Fairholme range was offering some things that other manufacturers weren't, which we now take for granted today. So straight away, before I even open the brochure up, the Fairholme had double glazed acrylic windows, which of course is the industry standard today, but still quite unusual in 1978. The Sprite range, the Eccles range, and the Europa range that sat below the Fairholme all still had glass windows in 1978, but we would see double glazed plastic windows massively take over the industry over the next 2 or 3 years at that particular point. So straight away we open up the brochure and you can see this is a very violently 1970s caravan. It kind of looks like the set of Abigail's Party, if you've ever seen that. It is hideous, but I would imagine very sophisticated at the time. The tagline at the top is "We've thought of everything," and straight away it's got the kit in it, which we're taking for granted now, but remember in 1978 this was very ahead of the game. Straight away you've got the Electrolux 212 fridge, which was gas or mains electric operated. You've got room for 2 large gas canisters, which again was starting to become more prevalent then as more appliances were fitted, but most caravans still ran the smaller 4.5 butane bottles, and Fairholme were providing space for the large 7 kilogram ones. It's got Carver central heating, thermostatically controlled, very posh. I've just got to read you this quote from the top because it's so of its time, and tell me after I've read this that you don't want one, because I'm sold. I'm totally sold after this. You'll notice the coordinated luxury furnishings, things like buttoned upholstery in Drayton brown velvet with floral pattern curtains from the Burgess Ledward Sandringham range, or the alternative Genesee tapestry pattern velvet with curtains in Marissa Gold Rose Regency stripes. Naturally, the same quality materials are used for the backrests, pelmets, and the pelmet fringes, as well as the scatter cushions. On the floor, there's a coffee-coloured plush pile carpet, while in the kitchen has tile effect cushion vinyl. And of course, to blend harmoniously with these luxury furnishings, there's rich, deep-toned, hand-finished natural timber on the cupboards, doors, cabinets and wardrobes. I'm sold. I mean, to be honest, they had me at pelmet fringes. Caravans in 2024 are consciously getting away from curtains, but obviously this was 1978 and this was probably the peak of bad 70s taste. I mean, I love a bit of orange and retro and green on my channel, and usually we look at the early 70s for that, but the Fairholme was so vividly late 1970s in its style. It's truly awful but awesome at the same time. I do love it. And if you pulled onto site with a Fairholme, people would have been quite envious, but they were typically for older people, and Caravans International were very good at marketing this. You'll notice throughout some of the cars used, they've got the Jaguar XJ6 there. There's even a rifle on one of the seats for the Fairholme Merlin advert, and fishing rods on the other page. And they're just selling this lifestyle that you can still escape to the country and indulge in these countryside sports, but really you live on the inside of the M25 in London, and you're an executive in a company. You've got a nice company Jaguar XJ6, so you've gone and bought your wife a lovely Fairholme caravan to go away in. It's so funny that the technology has evolved, but the idea behind it hasn't. But they're starting to get trapped in the 1970s. By this freedom to roam isn't quite so free as it used to be, and rightly so, because remember back in the 1920s Eccles were boasting that they had hundreds of their caravans on the road. Well, by the late 1970s, Caravans International alone were turning out more than 20,000 caravans a year, and they were just a small part of a huge British industry that exported all over Europe and the wider world in some cases. So it wouldn't really be practical for people to just pull up in farmers' fields and scale Glencoe, which by that point I've checked did have a proper access road. But it had to change, and it had kind of lost that freedom and that innocence that it once had. Caravans were now serious bits of kit, but make no mistake, the Fairholme was not an average caravan. You had to be quite wealthy still to afford one. And we had a lot more people coming into caravanning in the 1960s as more and more people were able to afford a car. They were affording the cheaper caravans such as the Sprite. And it's funny that all these years later, half a century later, people are investing in Fairholme level things as their first caravan. What with the advent of finance and PCP and all those kind of things, it's easier than ever to get hold of a caravan that has all the bells and whistles. And I think there's a bit of innocence lost there when you've had that basic caravan, just as my grandparents started with that 1966 Sprite 400 that has gas lamps and a foot pump and no fitted toilet. It kind of teaches you the basics. It kind of gives you something to experience that freedom with because it gets you closer to nature. Whereas when you buy a caravan that has everything in it, it's got central heating, you've got your TV in there, the blinds, the fitted shower and toilet and everything, and you don't have to speak to anyone all weekend, let alone go out and explore the surroundings. For me, it's kind of lost that romanticism that people insist that caravans needed. But as you'll see as we move on into the 1990s, Caravanners were still really, really hot for wood grain and sculptured velour upholstery, because despite the fact that now we'd moved so far from those earliest Eccles caravans into things that were like mobile homes, people still loved that romantic notion that it was at one with nature and getting away from it all. Just before we go any further, I just want to tell you how you can get to look through these magazines at your own leisure. If you head to the website www.themagazinearchive.com/CAMC, and that's Caravan and Motorhome Club, CAMC, you'll be brought to the homepage where if you are a paid member of the Caravan and Motorhome Club, you can enter your membership number as the password and you can freely browse the entire En Route magazine archive right back to January 1963 to the present day at your leisure. If you're not a paid Caravan and Motorhome Club member, don't worry, you can buy a membership pass for that particular magazine archive where you will find that entire Caravan and Motorhome Club magazine collection, in addition to absolutely dozens of car magazine archives dating back to the early 1900s. So if you've enjoyed today's video and like looking through these, do check that website out. And again, if you are a paid Caravan and Motorhome Club member, do use it. It's a free resource and there's no time limit on it. You can just go in and browse these at your leisure, although I'm warning you, it's quite addictive and you can really, really get stuck in to reading tons and tons of stuff about caravans over the years. As you can tell, I'm a little bit sad and I'm very, very impressed by the service, and it's the first of its kind for the caravan industry. So we're going to move on to October 1995, and it's the Caravan and Motorhome Club En Route magazine. And remember, the theme is still looking back. So there's an interesting article in here that talks about caravans from days gone by, but we've moved on a little bit from those earliest 1920s days of the Eccles. And I think straight away, we think of the 90s as being this very progressive decade. We think of it as being this time when technology improved and got better. But as you'll see by some of the caravans featured, the industry is beginning to get suffocated by those ideals that had kind of been set in the 1920s. And as we just seen in the 1970s, were still alive and well. And the industry had realized then that people didn't want to progress with design. They wanted that traditional view of what a caravan should be. And as you'll see in 1995, that ideal was still alive and well, trust me. So obviously in the first volume 1 of From the Archives tour, we took a look at how the Caravan and Motorhome Club magazine had evolved and the club in general over the years. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that today, but rather I'm going to jump to this article where they compare an ABI Award Northstar to a Lunar Delta 500-2. Now this is quite interesting because these were two caravans that were aimed at the same market. The ABI was without doubt the best seller of the two, But the ABI Award range was the 90s version of the Fairholme range that we looked at. So it was completely steeped in that design ideals that were set in the 1920s with its wood grain, its sculptured upholstery and all kinds of awfulness. But the Lunar was a modern take on it. The Lunar was a new idea and it was supposed to be a clean break from tradition. And one of the nice things that the Caravan and Motorhome Club used to do, and still sometimes does, is they compare to like for like caravans, and they get the feedback from owners of them to report on how they've got on and how they would rate the caravans and how satisfied they are with them overall. And it was quite a fair scoring system. It was out of 100 points, and they would have to rate the caravan, how it behaved on the road, how it was for sleeping, how good the washroom was, how practical the kitchen was, how spacious and comfortable the living area would be, the services it provided, which means like the equipment and all the things that were fitted, the quality and reliability, and then they would from that get an overall satisfaction score. So this was really important independent work from the Caravan and Motorhome Club to get tangible feedback from the members with their experiences of the caravans, and it's something that the club still does today. But it feeds into the Caravan Design Awards, and they use those scores to impact the outcome of the Design Awards. So you've got a panel of judges who are all experienced caravanners. I know because I was one of them last year. But they combine it with the feedback from members if it's a caravan that already existed, just to get a clear picture of what the winner should be. And it is, for me, the fairest and most comprehensive awards scheme of its kind in the caravan industry, and it absolutely deserves the kudos that it enjoys at the moment in the industry, because no one else puts as much effort into those awards than the Caravan and Motorhome Club do. And that's what's kind of lacking in the industry now, is that experience, and that is something that the Caravan and Motorhome Club are still bringing to the table. And you can read those articles and just think it's very commercial, but I absolutely assure you it's a very, very fair and completely independent judging process. And nobody looks more nervous than the manufacturers who are sat in the room on the day that the awards are announced, because they genuinely don't know. We as the judges don't even know who's won until the announcement. It is that sort of guarded in secrecy and judged fairly and independently. So anyway, back to these two caravans, and of course from the archives I have not the 1995 brochures unfortunately, but one from a few months before 1993 and 1994, but the caravans are pretty much the same. We've got the ABI Award brochure and the one for Lunar caravans. So we're going to take a look at the ABI one first, and I've always had a bit of an affinity to these because my first caravan was an ABI Award. But by this point in the 90s, they'd started to look old-fashioned, but they were still selling really well. So there's no pictures of the Nightstar, but you have to remember the decor and everything will be the same. So pictured we have the small Dawn Star, which you may remember Sam Alper referenced the boat-shaped roof. You'll see that's a prominent feature of the award range. So keeping that tradition, we've got the earthly green tones, and inside that's reflected with browns, and I don't even know what you describe this colour as. Actually, pause a second. What do they describe it as? They don't actually. They say it's just a harmony of carefully coordinated colours and tasteful choice of fabric. It's only their opinion. I don't think this has aged particularly very well. But ABI promise this is the luxury caravan of the highest order. So in terms of the spec, remember what the Fairholme had. The ABI now has a fitted shower, fitted toilet, a cassette toilet. It's got a proper hot water system. Still got the oven and grill that the Fairholme has. Still has the thermostatically controlled heating that the Fairholme has. So really, from 1978 to 1993, design hasn't evolved massively. And we're starting to see the problem here. But you have to remember, this range was a huge seller for ABI in the 1990s. And these sculptured wooden cupboards just look so old-fashioned now, but at the time were very much in vogue, and again keeps referencing back those earliest caravans from the 1900s. Just looking at some of the spec, it's very much similar. I think the biggest design difference is that the front locker is now incorporated into the bodywork of the Caravan, and this design, only Bailey at the moment are getting away from that. Manufacturers still love to put those front lockers in, and I have to actually commend ABI here, because their locker was double hinged and lifted up so you could get clear access to it. Nowadays most front lockers just fold up and you've got to stoop down to change your gas bottles, and you just think, the average age of Caravanners, why have we not evolved to this design on every Caravan now? But I guess that comes down to cost. But anyway, ABI Caravans were massively successful. British company, won the Queen's Award for Exports in 1988, and they were just the biggest name in caravans. And I'm trying to not digress too much from this article, but they still offered an amazing range of caravans by then, which accommodated all tastes. And just for the sake of a little bit of nostalgia, let's look back at some of them. We start the range at the bottom with the Marauder, which was one of the best-selling caravan ranges in Britain in the 1980s. This was a very simplified, very modern looking caravan. It's got this kind of ash wood interior that's light and airy, but the spec is still pretty good. It's got a battery box fitted, it's got mains electrics, it's got a hot water system, it's got a shower, it's got heating, but they've just, you know, redacted on things like the oven. They don't fit the oven in it, and they don't have just some of the refinements that the ABI Award has. But if you had a little bit more money, you could move up to the Ace range. This was kind of similar style to the Marauder. We've got 3 opening front windows, which is something that the caravan industry just cannot get away from in Britain, no matter how hard they try, for reasons I don't really understand, to be honest. But the Ace range was just a bit of a step up, a bit more luxury and refinement, a few more things fitted. But then you could move up again to the Jubilee, which was kind of the modern alternative to the ABI Award. So you'll notice in this particular one, there's no chest of drawers at the front. It's got the U-shape, which was known as kind of the European layout of its time. Instead of the 3 front windows, it's just got 2 at the front, which is still pretty unique to this day. But again, the Jubilee range was a massive seller. It really was a big seller in the 90s, and it offered something for everyone at an affordable price, and you could spec the caravan up to suit you. So some of the options did include fitting the oven. Let me just move. They did include upgrading the heating. You could fit blinds and fly screens. They weren't a standard fitting back in 1993, and also the cassette toilet wasn't standard on all models, particularly in the Marauder range at that point. So ABI were catering for everyone back then, but they were obviously steeped in tradition and still referencing that research done in the 1970s by Caravans International. But over at Lunar, who were on the opposite side of the country, so ABI were produced in Hull, and Lunar were over in Preston and Lancashire. I'm from Yorkshire, so the wrong side of the hill. Just going to skip through the Lunar brochure quickly, but the Delta 502 was a luxury caravan, and it still has a lot of the trappings of the ABI Award range. There's a lot of wood grain, a lot of earthly tones. They've got green curtains and pink upholstery. Don't make me look at that picture any longer than I have to, it's awful. But you'll notice that the woodwork is a lot simpler than the ABI Award. It's a lot more toned down, it's a lot more muted. There's a lot more textures going on with the textured ceiling board, very plain short pile carpet. And the Lunar from the outside looks very different. It doesn't have a boat-shaped roof, it's got a flat roof. It's got this big curvaceous front end panel, and this particular design was kind of a forerunner to the things that would come along in the late 1990s. Certainly Lunar would carry that design on. Fleetwood would do something similar, and probably most famously Eldis would jump on the bandwagon too with the EX2000 range, and earlier the Eldis Genesis pretty much pinched like for like the Lunar's front end, but exaggerated it further. But the Lunar had a party trick which hasn't been seen before or since, and that was that the front axle could be hydraulically lifted up to allow the twin axle Caravan to be manoeuvred easier. And I don't know why we don't do this now. It would be, I guess it's down to cost, but the chassis was of Lunar's own design. And if I remember rightly, there was a hand pump in the front locker where you could pump the hydraulic fluid around to lift that front axle up. So you were just manoeuvring a single axle chassis. It was truly groundbreaking, and I remember everyone used to really rave about it. But Lunar were the first and only manufacturer to do it. I definitely think it's a design feature that should probably make a reappearance on caravans now, just to make them easier to manoeuvre in an era where caravans are heavier than they've ever been, thanks to all the various bits of spec that gets added. So, how did they compare? Between the two of them, the Lunar just nudged above the ABI award, and really it was down to the layouts that they offered compared to the ABI award. They lost out on quality and reliability, which was always Lunar's issue. It plagued them for years. They had these great ideas and always built these lightweight caravans, but they had horrendous issues with quality, and eventually we lost Lunar. Not too long ago, I think it was 2017, 2018, they went out of business officially for the last time, but there've been various buyouts in the years before, and they were known industry-wide as the leaky Lunars, just because they were really unreliable. So it was a long time coming, and it's a shame because the innovation was there, the idea was there, and they were selling well, and they were well received by the buyers. But it's another story of what could have been. But it's interesting that you've got two takes on what a top-of-the-range caravan should be. You've got the traditional ABI award that's still steeped in history and is as uninnovative as it gets, really, apart from adding lots of spec into it and lots of gadgets and gizmos. And on the flip side, you've got Lunar, who are designing, I wouldn't say the caravan of the future, but it's modern, it's current, it's up to date, and it's a premium level product that has forward-thinking technology on it. And that's where we start to see the shift in these models, because today that is really well reflected in caravan design overall. But back then it was quite unusual that a premium level manufacturer would break away from those norms for their typically higher priced products, just because they knew it would be a hard sell. So anyway, back on topic, back to the Caravan and Motorhome Club magazine. We have this article called Nostalgic Weekends, which is about people who get away in those caravans from the earliest days of caravanning. And this is a new phenomenon in the 1990s, people who are actively getting together with these older caravans. So we started in the 1970s, where people are looking back on this era with nostalgia. By the 1990s, it's grown to the point where people are now buying these old caravans, restoring them and keeping them going to keep that memory of them alive, I guess, and remember these pioneers of the caravan industry. And to this day, I know more than most, because I was one of the co-founders of the Retro Camping Club, that nostalgia sells, and people still will buy these old caravans and restore them. But back in 1995, that was quite a new idea, and we started to look towards preserving bits from the past. Which leads me on to my final piece from the archives today, which is an interview with Angela Willis, who was the curator of the Caravan and Motorhome Club collection at the Beaulieu Motor Museum. And the collection have preserved the Bertram, Hutchings, Winchester archives, among many other things. And when I caught up with her the summer before last, we took a look through at some of the items of interest from the archives. So I'm going to show you that now.
Well, this is an incredible photograph album from the collection of Bertram Hutchings, who built Winchester Caravans.
Yeah.
And this album, it's just particularly interesting. It's a tour that he took of Bavaria and the Austrian Tyrol in 1937. So just a couple of years before the outbreak of the Second World War. So it just shows a real fascinating insight into touring and travel in Germany at that time. And what's so fascinating about this album is kind of the backstory, really. Bertram Hutchings was invited to take the tour in a Winchester Royal, which he built, and he sold it at the 1935 motor show. And it was actually purchased by a German called Jakob Verlin, who was very senior in Mercedes in Germany. And in 1937, Verlin invited Hutchings to come over and to take a tour in the caravan that he purchased from Hutchings, and he also loaned him a car to take the trip as well. But when you look a bit more closely at the photos, you can see Jakob Verlin was actually a close personal friend of Adolf Hitler. So you can see on the front of the car that he's loaned Bertram Hutchings, it's actually got the flags with the swastikas on the front of that.
So really this collection goes beyond just an archive about the club and caravans. We've got social history here.
Yes, yeah, it's an incredible example of the kind of the social history of particularly the 20th century, which is woven throughout the collection. And Bertram Hutchings went with his friend Frank Palmer Cook, who was involved in the army. So we do wonder a little bit whether he kind of went with Bertram on the tour for a reason. It's something that we're kind of researching a lot more at the moment.
So presumably when the collection gets items like this, you don't necessarily have a backstory. It's your job to research everything.
Absolutely. Sometimes we're very lucky and the full story of something will come in. The donor or the depositor will give us all the information. But quite often we need to spend time, looking into it more, more closely. And that's where our kind of archive of the Caravan magazine for this sort of 1930s period is just so useful, because we're able to sort of go back through and often marry the two up together. Bertram Hutchings used a lot of his photographs for advertising, but he was also very good at submitting articles to the Caravan magazine as well. He didn't always use them in his name, so he often submitted them in a different name, so the magazine kind of didn't look like they were promoting him.
I didn't know that. It's quite interesting. So really it's sort of, when I get an old caravan, I might start with a photo of it and then cross-reference that with the magazine and the brochure, and so you kind of do the same thing, really.
Yes, absolutely. It's sort of a source of knowledge. So it's something we're still trying to find out a bit more about. And Jakob Verlin, the gentleman that owned the caravan, we've been trying to find out a little bit more about him, and our understanding was sort of at the end of the war he was then tried and put in prison for a few years because of his connections with the SS. He was the head of transport for the SS, but we've also found kind of evidence of stories to say that he actually helped Jewish families to escape as well. So he's kind of an interesting character that we're only at the start of finding out about.
It's quite exciting, really, as someone who's interested in history like yourself, it goes way beyond just the caravans, doesn't it?
Yes.
You've got to have a broad knowledge of everything.
Yes, a broad knowledge of kind of 20th century history really sort of comes into this role, absolutely. And we've done projects in the past looking at, the impact of the First World War on the development of trailer caravanning, and we've also looked at suffragettes, early club members who are also members of the suffragettes movement. So you can see how all these things that happen in the 20th century kind of filter into the club collection and its history in some way.
Here's me thinking I want this job because I get to read caravan magazines all day, but it's actually much harder than that, isn't it?
It's quite complex sometimes, but it's really rewarding, just sort of, recovering the stories, discovering new things. It's very interesting.
So there you have it. There's been a little tour of caravan design over the past 100 years, and this video could easily be a few hours long if I could get more things out, but I'm trying to keep it concise and keep it interesting and keep it moving. But I think it's fascinating how the overall message here is that the ideals of caravans were set way back in the 1920s, and it's been impossible for manufacturers to move too far from those ideals that were set all that time ago. And current caravan design is much of a sameness. They've still got the 3 front windows at the front. They've still got excess use of wood grain inside. We still have a lot of earthly tones used, such as browns, beiges. Don't really see green that much anymore, purely because I think it's been done to death in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But caravan manufacturers are still trapped. But there's one very big difference with today's caravan design, and that is that there's been a huge influx of new caravanners to the scene since the COVID pandemic. And these people don't come with this knowledge of the past. They don't come with this, it's always been this way because it's always been this way attitude. They come with fresh ideas. They come with questions as to why caravans all look the same. They come to places like my YouTube channel to see what else is out there, because they don't want a conventional white box. And I think we're at the very beginning of a bit of a revolution in caravan design that might finally see mass-produced caravans move on a little bit for the first time in over 100 years. So I'm being a little bit facetious there, because obviously caravans now are a very, very, very long way from these earliest Eccles designs. They're even a long way from the 1970s Fairholme designs. But you start to see the similarities from this point onwards. And really, especially things like the ABI award, we've not moved too, I mean, that basic shape of the caravan is still pretty much how every caravan looks today. So although we try to move it forward, we try to introduce new technology, we're still trapped by that. And I have a lot of faith in the new people to the hobby who are going to try and demand more from the caravans. And I think it's high time that things moved on a bit, in the same way that the Caravan and Motorhome Club has kept evolving and changing. And when you think of the close-knit gentleman's club it was back in 1907 to the huge holiday organisation it is today, with a massive network of sites and allowing all different outfits and people to join. As of this year, you've got the Experience Freedom package, where you can become a member if you don't even own a caravan or motorhome, and you can use their site network for glamping and camping and all those kind of things. And the club has done a good job of evolving and moving, and I think the industry tries to do the same, but gets trapped by those ideals that were kind of finalised and confirmed in the 1970s. So I'm excited for where caravan design will go, and I have faith that it might move on a bit in the next decade. But who knows? We're going to keep talking about it on Not Another White Box. So if you've enjoyed today's video and love talking about caravan design, I suggest that you join the Not Another White Box Facebook group. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And also, if you enjoyed the Bertram Hutchings archive bit, I have a video of the Bertram Hutchings Winchester that I used to own, a video tour of that, which I'll pop a link to above. But other than that, make sure you follow Not Another White Box on all forms of social media, and also please do subscribe to the channel, because it really helps me out and allows me to keep producing new content like this. So if you've enjoyed it, let me know. Love to know your thoughts on today's video in the comments below. But apart from that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.